Thank you, Congressman, President, Doctor, and all of the other distinguished titles you carry so well. And Dr. Billington, thank you for having this Canadian at the prestigious Library of Congress. You know, I tweeted today that we would be doing a live broadcast from here, and I signed off my tweet by calling myself the Jeffersonian Canadian. Try explaining that one back home. I want to also point out, for what this is worth, and I think it's worth a lot, that we're in the midst of two Midwestern congressmen. That's a disproportionate amount of power that I think it's high time the Midwest claimed. And I'm here really at the beginning to introduce my good friend, Keith Ellison. You can see I'm on a first-name basis with him, and I hope you don't mind. I will refer to him as Keith. I consider him not just a good friend, but a kindred spirit. And I think you'll see why this morning. I want to tell you two stories. I didn't know Keith a few years ago. He, in fact, is the one who introduced himself to me. And he did so in 2006, when he first ran for Congress. He emailed me out of the blue through my website. This was during his campaign. He didn't say much, except the inexplicably surprising thing that he supports my work. I wasn't used to hearing that from a Muslim. And he left his phone number, and I called him. We instantly clicked, and when he was elected, not so long after, I came to DC, and I visited him at his office. And this is a second story I want to tell you. One of the first things that jumped out at me when I walked into his office, festooned with photos of him and VIPs and posters, social justice, righteousness, progressive politics. But I remember very distinctly, one photo jumped right out at me as I walked in. And that was a picture with Congressman Ellison and Shimon Peres, President of Israel. I didn't say anything at the time, but I've since told him how much I admired his moral courage in simply having that photo there front and center. Because you can appreciate that as the first Muslim elected to Congress, here is this guy who's going to have no shortage of Muslim lobbyists coming through his office. And with a photo like that, what is instantly telegraphed is, I'm a pluralist, I refuse to engage in narrow identity politics, and by the way, I'm no pushover. And I want to thank Congressman Ellison for being a role model for a new generation. Though I'm not much younger than he is, but he has been very much a mentor to me. We don't agree on everything, and maybe some of our differences will come out, but this I will finally say about Keith. To me, he embodies a very basic principle of democracy, which is disagreeing with one another's ideas does not mean denying one another's humanity. And I thank you for that, brother. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my good friend and yours, Congressman Keith Ellison.
Thank you very much, Irshad. Appreciated that very warm and personal introduction. And also, Mr. Billington, thank you for your excellent stewardship. And Mr. Branham, Mr. Congressman, thank you for all the long service that you've provided to our great country. And my good friend, Jim Moran, we've been shoulder to shoulder for a long time, isn't that right? And it's great to be here with you. And I look forward to our dialogue, which we're going to share. So I'm going to try to fit within my time frame. First of all, discussing Islam and freedom is a tricky subject for me And the reason why it's tricky is because there's no doubt that if we discuss Islam and freedom, we will end up at a point of conversation where we can't avoid it, talk about how some Muslims have used Islam to deprive people of freedom. And we can't escape that. That's going to be part of this conversation today. And it's tricky, though, because we do live in an America where Islamophobia is reality. Recently, the Center for American Progress released a report called Fear, Inc., and detailed the network of people who are promoting religious bigotry against Muslims. Now, this is a fact, but I offer to you that we can do two things at once. We can walk and chew gum. We can talk about how, yes, there's Islamophobia, bigotry against Muslims. It's ugly, and every person of every faith and non-faith should stand against religious bigotry of all kinds all the time. But also, there's no question that some people have exploited Islam to deny other people freedom. And yet, I want to close with very promising, hopeful developments, which I think and hope will grow. Muhammad. In Islam, it's traditional to say, peace and blessings be upon him, was the recipient of revelation, according to Muslim belief, at the age of 40. Before that, he was a man who was well trusted. He was a business person. He married a woman 15 years older than him at her invitation. He was known as Amin, which means worthy, and trustworthy. But at 40, he received revelation. And when he received that revelation, he was living in a city that you and I know today as Mecca. And in the city he was living in, offering an alternative vision of how God speaks to mankind wasn't really well received. He started teaching in private and telling people that there was only one God and that they should not worship the stones and the rocks and the idols that people worship. And more than that, the people who are in slavery shouldn't be that way, and you can get blessings by freeing slaves. And he spoke to people who in fact were in slavery and offered them a message of hope and liberation. He spoke to women and said that female infanticide was repugnant and offensive in the eyes of God. He talked about how the rich must not and should not take advantage of the poor, and how working people are due to be paid fairly for the work that they do. He talked about justice, and he talked about the need for change in what was the status quo of Mecca at the time. And he wasn't greeted with the authority with great gladness. He was met with extreme opposition. At first, they rebuked him. And after that, they threatened him. Then they tried to bribe him. And then they started arresting and persecuting and even torturing his followers and people who followed him. After they did that, they murdered some of his followers, and then they got so extreme that his community had to leave their hometown of Mecca. Some of them had to escape to Ethiopia, where they were told that there is a good king there. The king happened to be an Ethiopian Christian king. And then some escaped to a city at the time known as Yathrib. And in Yathrib, there was a pretty diverse population. Some people were, they had their own traditional religions, what you might call pagan or polytheists. And then there were Jews there, and there were Christians there. And when Muhammad, he sent his followers there first, and then members of the Muslim community. But when he finally arrived, the people of Yathrib had a meeting and decided that because of his reputation for fairness, that they would like him to lead their city. Now he was in a position to replicate the top-down power relationship that he suffered under. He escaped a system where freedom was deprived, freedom of people who were literally in bondage, freedom were deprived from women, freedom deprived from workers, freedom was deprived for people who simply wanted to speak their own religious truth as revealed. And he escaped that environment where freedom was denied and went to a new place that was renamed Medina. Medina simply means city. And when he was in a position to say, now I'm the boss, now I'm going to do things my way, people are going to follow my rules, and if they don't, I'm going to act just like the Meccans and impose a rigid orthodoxy and punish people who don't do what I say, he denied the opportunity to do what he clearly could have done. Instead, he opted for something called the Charter of Medina. Charter of Medina. Some of you know about it, some of you don't. I say it slow because if you've never heard of it, I want you to look it up. And in this document, notice the Charter of Medina, it is a document that constituted relations between the state and all of the people who lived in the city. It said things that I think you might find interesting. What it said in the charter is that there's equality before the law. People who are of other faiths and not Muslim, including Jews, Christians, and people who followed traditional religions, would have equal political, cultural rights as the Muslims and have autonomy and freedom of religion. In fact, the words are written, no Jew will be persecuted for being a Jew. This is in this Medina Charter. People who are not Muslims would be asked to join with the other parts of the community to protect the city and to share in the costs of it, but not at a greater basis than the Muslims would be, just an equal basis. And people of other faiths would not be obligated to take part in any religious conflicts that Muslims had with other people. So in defense of the city, everybody's in. If it was a Muslim problem, they would not be required to participate. This is what Muslim scholars, which I am not one, would call the sirah of the prophet, in the context of the prophet's life. But there is actually language in the Quran which supports this idea that Prophet Muhammad found himself, after receiving revelation, in an oppressive environment where he tried to exercise freedom of expression, had to leave that environment, tried to establish, and in fact did establish, freedom of faith and worship and civic participation. But the words of the Quran even, I think, reinforce this idea that the very beginnings of the mission of Muhammad was to react against a condition of unfreedom and then to establish it in another city. But the Quran says there is no compulsion in matters of faith. Distinct now is the way of guidance from error. He who turns away from the forces of evil and believes in God will surely hold fast to a handle that is strong and unbreakable. It also says, then whosoever wills, let him believe, and whosoever wills, let him disbelieve. And it also says, there is apparently, and it also goes on to say other things, but it's important to note what's not in the Quran. There is apparently no verse in the Quran which states that a Muslim who repudiates Islam should be punished by death. This is an invention of people who came later. And so my point here is to establish that at the very beginning of the mission of Muhammad, freedom characterized the way he approached faith and he approached and interacted with the world. Now, you should know that time, of course, passed by, and we ended up with people who used religion to establish their own personal power, and things became orthodox, things became politically, where political interests became at stake, empires developed and fell, and of course, Islam, interpreted as the words of Quran were, began to change. And somehow, in the time that we live in now, we've arrived at a place where there's in the Muslim world, we see a distinct absence of freedom. I argue to you that the very origin of the Arab awakening is a condition in many countries in the region where freedom is denied, where people can't speak their truth. You couldn't get up and say, I think that Mr. Mubarak is not a good leader. You certainly couldn't act on it. Where you can't simply say, as a woman, I'd like to drive to the grocery store to pick up a few items. That would be illegal. Even in countries, democratic Muslim majority countries like Indonesia, there are fundamentalists who received light sentences when they launched a deadly attack on a Muslim sect known as the Ahmadiyya followers, and they continue to fear persecution from people who don't think they're Muslim enough. Prayer services at the Ahmadiyya Mosque in Jakarta draw hundreds of followers, but there is still a police detail because people fear what others who don't approve of their practice might do to them. Pakistan, 170 million people, Muslim country, continues to be a country where Sikhs are prevented from praying. Ahmadiyya community and the Shia are killed at worship. Shrines of patron saints are destroyed. And of course, we know that in Egypt, we've seen Coptic churches attacked. And we've also seen, according to the United Nations report, which focuses on the development and the condition of freedom, and particularly the 2002 version, found the full spectrum of factors accounting for shortfalls in the area of human development, particularly in the Arab world. This was written by Arab authors, and found that there were development deficits in the area of knowledge, women's empowerment, and freedom. And of course, there are many Muslim countries and even Muslims in the United States who were exposed to the protocols of the learned elders of Zion and hold and harbor ideas about people who are Jewish that are inaccurate and clearly unfair. So, and then recently, just on our own 9/11, there were a group of Muslims who thought the best thing for them to do is to go outside the American embassy in London and to denounce America on a day where we were memorializing a horrible tragedy and grieving from losses that we suffered. Sadly, they got headlines. And so, look, the fact is, there are many important examples of Muslims around the world and right here in the United States who hold fast to freedom, who offer freedom and argue for it, work for it, and demand it not only for themselves but for people. But there is no doubt that that we need a revival of this early Islamic idea of freedom. We need a revival where we can say that you can be whatever faith you want to be, and that there should be no worshiper in any country in the world who has to fear what Muslims are going to do to them. Now, the truth is, Islam has historically and traditionally and in the main been a country that lived in side by side with people of other faiths, but no one can deny that there is an important and a distinct deprivation of freedom around issues of religious tolerance around the world in Muslim majority countries. This is something we should take seriously. Now, I urge us, particularly Muslims in the audience, to not take this personally, but instead to take it seriously. And that when you stand up and say, I will not tolerate the persecution of Christians, Jews, or any other kind of minority Muslim sect or anyone, as long as I'm around, and I will denounce it if I can, I will speak against it, I will use law to help protect, then I think that we need the moral courage to do that. We need to be able to say, we are following the Sunnah by doing this. We are following Quran by doing this. And that those people who, in the name of Islam, would try to attack religious minorities, deprive women of rights, these people are actually operating outside the Sunnah. They are engaging in innovation or bid'ah. It is in the root of the mission of Muhammad that people would be free. People would be free to choose. which faith they wanted to be, to believe or to disbelieve. And so I think it's important for us at this moment, particularly in this space, to understand that a number of things can be true all at the same time. One, that the Muslim community in America is under siege. Islamophobia is a fact. But at the same time, internal work by the Muslim community to re-embrace freedom and to assert it as core and rudimentary Islamic value is important to do right now. Will we and can we reclaim freedom as a basic tenet of Islamic belief? Now, let me just say this about freedom as I begin to wind up. Freedom to agree with me is not freedom at all. Freedom to say as I say is not freedom. Freedom to dress how I dress is not freedom. Freedom to pray how I pray is not freedom. Freedom only has relevance when there's difference. There's no relevance to freedom if it's just replication of what I do. If I believe in freedom, then I believe that you see the world, pray differently than I do, yet I am willing to protect your right to be different. That's what freedom is. Freedom is I'm willing to protect myself and expend time, energy, and resources, and even sometimes personal security to make sure you can do different from what I do. This is an important idea that we have to absolutely rediscover. Because back in Medina, Muhammad could simply say, if you're not a Muslim, you got to just get out of town. If you don't see the world the way I see it and worship as I worship, you have to go. But he said, no, be as you are, worship as you worship, and we will live as one ummah in this community. In Medina, people who of other faiths who were not Muslim were considered part of the ummah. Read it. It's there. So let me just close by leaving you with some very bright developments. In this time where the Muslim community has been holding off Islamophobia, it hasn't done it alone. In my own city of Minneapolis, in St. Paul, we gathered for a 9/11 observance that the Muslim community was part and parcel of, but joined in on an interfaith basis with other people of other faiths, Christians, Jews, people who don't worship at all, to commemorate and honor the 9/11 first responders and to memorialize the victims. In my own city of Minneapolis, at the masjid I go to every Friday that I'm in Minneapolis, we joined with the Jewish community to observe our breaking of the fast. Recently, a few years ago, Ramadan and Yom Kippur coincided on the calendar. And at that time, the leader of the masjid I go to and the rabbi of the largest synagogue got the congregations together. And when we went to prayer, right, but what we call Maghrib prayer, Jews and Christians who were there stood and watched us do our prayer before the breaking of the fast and listened to the imam do a little reminder about what Ramadan and fasting is all about. And then we ceded the floor to the Jews who then went through their fast-breaking ritual, and they explained the ritual and the meaning of the ritual as they went through it. And then we did something interesting. We went downstairs and we broke the fast. 120 people said they were coming, but 180 people actually showed up. The rabbi and the imam said this was a good problem. We then went downstairs, and the rabbi and the imam said there's not enough chairs for everybody, so we will sit on the floor. People started getting up and leaving their seats just so they could sit on the floor and give someone else a seat. Children were running around. Some of the children had on hijabs. Some had on kufis. Some had on yarmulkes. But they were all playing as kids do, annoying their parents. And before the evening was over, I remember walking past a wooden box that we have in the masjid, the mosque. And an older lady who was Jewish said, "Sadaqah." And I said, hey, we call it sadaqah, but it's the same idea. It's charity, it's giving, it's justice, it's balancing. So I urge you to go out there, whether you're a Muslim or whether you are Jewish or Christian or practice another faith or no faith, to go out there and build the interfaith movement. to argue for freedom, to proclaim and defend the right of others to be different, to say, I don't do that, but if you do, it's fine with me, because I recognize your inherent dignity as a human being. And I don't worship anybody but God, so of course, I'm not going to yield to anyone's idea of dogmatic orthodoxy. We're going to go to the root. So let me conclude by simply saying it's been an honor to be here, and I look forward to a very fruitful and important dialogue. We can confront Islamophobia, and we can demand freedom all at the same time. Thank you very much.
Congressman, you made so many interesting points in your talk just now, and I want to pick up on one of those points and apply it to how I have personally reconciled my faith and the universal, as we now know, universal aspiration of freedom. You mentioned that as somebody who worships God and God alone, you are encouraging others as well to not succumb to other people's dogmatic orthodoxy. In other words, the human construct of dogmatic orthodoxy. I argue in Allah, Liberty, and Love that because I am a monotheist, because I believe in one God, not God's self-appointed ambassadors, I'm actually obliged to defend human liberty. And here's why. If you worship one God alone, you believe that only that God has the full and final truth of anything. Therefore, you don't, I don't, and nobody in this audience does either. So we've got to accept our limited knowledge, which in turn means that it's a spiritual duty to contribute to societies in which we can disagree with one another in peace and with civility. Why? Because anything less means that we're playing God with one another. And in any monotheism, that is the elemental sin. So the beauty of this approach is that worshiping one God and one God alone compels you, really, and happily so in my case, to defend the liberty of human beings. Okay.
Well, I agree wholeheartedly.
Well, I can see that. Here's the problem. Well, actually, there are a few problems. Let's tackle a couple of them right here and now. I remember when I was growing up in Vancouver, Canada, and I attended the madrasa, the Islamic religious school, I would ask very basic questions. And that really ticked my teacher off. And at one point, at the age of 14, when he tried to convince me that Jews are treacherous and not to be trusted because they worship mullah, money, not Allah, God, I remember saying to him, but wait a minute, all of the new stores in our suburb just south of Vancouver have signs in the Asian language, in Japanese and Cantonese and Mandarin and Hindi and Punjabi. I didn't see any Yiddish signs, I told him. And he said to me, either you believe or you get out. And if you get out for good, which I did. But what I didn't do is I didn't leave God. I may have left the madrasa. I had to explain this one to my mother. I had to leave the madrasa, but I didn't leave God and I didn't leave Islam. My question to you is, why are Muslims so defensive?
Well, I think defensiveness is not anything Muslims have a monopoly over. But I will say that there are certainly defensive Muslims. And in the case that you mentioned, I think that there is something within the human ego that wants to ascribe to itself power that it's not entitled to. And in your case, this person really did set himself up as some sort with divine power of omniscient knowledge, and was willing to enforce his omniscient state of mind by kicking you out. This, to me, is the antithesis of freedom. It's the antithesis of freedom because if he was really trying to teach Islam, what he would do is say, you know what? That's how I was taught. Why don't you debate me perhaps we can all arrive at a better place.
Now, again, I don't know anybody in this room today who would disagree with what you've just said, but you've also acknowledged more than once in your talk there's a problem. You're right that Muslims don't have the monopoly on defenses, but even moderate Muslims, I find, can become quite hostile when you ask challenging questions. One of the examples I use when speaking in this country is that when Major Nidal Malik Hassan opened fire on his fellow soldiers at Fort Hood, Texas, with the words, Allahu Akbar, God is greater, dripping from his lips. You can't blame non-Muslim Americans for wondering, what role does religious inspiration play in this man's crime? Now, here's the thing. I find that after every such incident, beheading, bombing, shooting, whatever the case may be, done by a Muslim, often in the name of Islam, and that's the key, not just the fact that he's Muslim, but again, utters words that have religious inspiration attached to them, the first thing you will hear out of the mouth of American moderate Muslims is, no, 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 don't misunderstand. Islam has nothing to do with this. Now, that's patently not true, which is not to say that Islam inspired it. But what I find is that when we deny that a certain religious role has been played here, the suspicions of non-Muslims rise. So in the effort to try and quell what you would call Islamophobia, by denying what is obvious to everybody else, in fact, we seem to feed it. Exactly.
You know, I got to tell you that I think that you're onto something here, and I want to say that like I said before, I don't think that this is a exclusive Muslim condition, but it is the case that people want to ego invest their point of view with a higher justification than simply they're murderous, they're hateful, they're psychologically disturbed. I mean, it's absolutely the case that people who engage in terrorism, whatever religion they be associated with, always want to connect their actions with something bigger, something noble. There's no question about it. The fact is, if I was a person of another faith and I heard that this person committed a horrific act and invoked the name of Allah, I might be afraid of that. Mm-hmm. And so you cannot stop people from doing bad things. But the community can rise up and say, this doesn't reflect us, this is not the standard, and yes, this person exploited our faith tradition for evil ends. I mean, I think it's important to, people talking now about moderate Muslims, I mean, your religion is a reflection of who you are. You identify with your religion. And so if people attack your religion, you're really defending yourself more so than you're defending the religion. And if you feel that you have to, and so people get emotional when you challenge basic questions of their identity, and they sometimes even get irrational. And so, I mean, this is an important challenge facing the Muslim community. How do we deal with the idea that some people taking a understanding of Islam, one understanding of Islam, still allow our faith to fully inform us and inspire us, but at the same time stand against somebody who uses it in an exploitive way?
Well, you've hit on a word that I think is so central to any constructive dialogue about freedom and particularly the faith of Islam, and that is identity. It seems to me that identity is something that other people hand to you, and you decide if you're going to accept that label as your own. Now, the problem often with identity is that it's not multifaceted. You're either or. You are this or that. And so one emotionally invests and over-invests oneself into that label so that the moment an uncomfortable question is asked that threatens that label in any way, then you feel, and this is, the word here is feel because you just pointed out it can become very emotional and even irrational. You feel that you are being assaulted. I point out to my students, identity is not the same as integrity. Integrity is what you give to yourself. And it literally means wholeness, your multifaceted wholeness, so that you can be Muslim and many other things at the same time. After all, if the Creator that we worship is indeed majestic, as I believe He is, then such a God that is worthy of our worship doesn't manufacture widgets. He invests us, endows us with uniqueness as individuals, even as we affiliate with particular groups.
Yeah, you know, I mean, there is this phenomenon among human beings where we engage in zero-sum thinking.
Yeah.
I am this or I am that. And if you attack if you attack my identity, I can't operate rationally. I have to defend myself. I literally have to fight for the life of my identity. But I argue that we should release these identities because, of course, as human beings, we are multiple identities. So I'm a father. I'm a member of Congress. I'm a Muslim. I'm a male. I'm an African American. I mean,
You're a basketball player?
Not a very good one. but the point is, we defend these identities or an identity because it seems like if we don't, we somehow sense that we will be obliterated.
Right.
You know? And so we defend these identities. When in truth, I mean, going back to your point about your conception of the divine, and using the Arabic word Allah, I mean, I often find myself confused when I hear Muslims say, I'm going to defend Islam because what are you defending? We teach in Islam that God doesn't need, you can't add to God. You can't take away from God. Nothing you do can either improve or diminish God. So what are you defending? What you're really defending is yourself. So these guys who got really out of joint about the cartoons, what were they defending? They certainly were not defending Islam because Islam needs no defense. They were defending an identity. They were defending an identity. And I want to say that I'm proud of people, Muslims in the United States and people who have other faiths in the United States, because when Terry Jones wanted to burn Qurans, he had one purpose and one purpose only. That is to offend Muslim identity so that Muslims would have an emotional, irrational response that he then could photograph and then use it to reinforce the idea of savage, crazy, out-of-control people. But somehow, we came to the conclusion that, you know, first of all, you can't actually burn the Quran. Let me tell you, you cannot burn the Quran. Why can't you burn the Quran? Because that book is not the Quran. That is a written out version of the Quran. But it's not the Quran. The Quran, there are literally thousands, maybe millions of people who are what they call Hafiz al-Quran, who have memorized it, and that's the Quran. They said Muhammad was a walking Quran. But to burn a book, here's an interesting fact. When a Quran starts to get worn out and the binding on it is broken down and it's just not, you know, good anymore, you cannot throw it in the garbage. What do Muslims do with it? They burn it. You retire a Quran by burning it. So it's really no offense to burn a Quran, and the offense is to offend. That's the thing, to try to be disrespectful. And yet, the worst thing you can do to a provocateur is reward them by being provoked. And so, if I may, because I don't want to go on too long, the thing that set this thing on a clear path is I remember studying a story when Muhammad the Prophet was in Medina, and he was in the prayer area that Muslims call Musalla, and with other believers, and a man who they described as a Bedouin came in and urinated right there on the floor. And of course, the guys who were there obviously rose up to do what? Get him, right? And yet Muhammad said, let him finish. Leave him alone. Let him finish. And he finished. And then he said, you guys get some water and clean it up. And they did, because they listened to what their leader said. And this man said to him, I came in here with a conception of who you were. But after the way you handled this situation, I don't need any more explanation. And it turned his heart.
We live in cynical times, and not so long ago, you mentioned Pastor Terry Jones, so-called Pastor Terry Jones, and his effort to provoke Muslims by burning the Quran. I was on MSNBC's Hardball with Chris Matthews at the time, and Chris said to me, what are we supposed to do when a gesture like that will, inspire and incite violence thousands of miles away in places like Afghanistan? And I said, Chris, there is no easy answer to that question, but what I would suggest is that Muslim Americans, if they're going to hold some kind of a counter rally, some kind of a counter protest, come with signs saying, Allah loves Terry Jones, and so do I. Respond with love. And Chris Matthews said to me, I'm never going to be invited back on the show. Chris Matthews, completely dismissed that idea of love, completely dismissed it. Now, that's not to say he's not himself a loving human being, but the point is that perhaps on cable TV, if nowhere else, love doesn't jive. Love is not where it's at. And my question is, how do we preach that message of love? And it does require preaching in many ways, but with an approach that isn't instantly met with the cynicism of a materialistic society that it has invested itself in instant gratification. Give me the result now. Don't give me human growth and human development. Don't give me your journey. Give me the result.
Love and peace, so powerful. I mean, the thing about it is that if you say I'm a loving person who wants nothing but peace with others, people will say, well, you're just cowardly. You're afraid to fight them. Or they'll say,
you're a sellout.
Or you're a sellout.
Yeah.
You just want to sell out.
You just want to appease.
You're an appeaser.
The oppressors.
You're an appeaser who wants to oppress. You're a sellout. You lack conviction. You're not down for the group, right? You lack loyalty. All of these negative words will be sort of heaped on you, and have been on great lovers in our world, like Martin Luther King, like Gandhi, like Bacha Khan.
Yes, Islam's Gandhi.
Right. Being a loving, peaceful human being is dangerous. People often feel threatened by it and want to attack you for it. But it's so profoundly courageous. And I can tell you, I'm no paragon of love and peace myself, but in the times that I've tried it, it's worked amazingly well for me. I remember being on Glenn Beck's show, and Glenn Beck said, Keith Ellison, I know Muslims, I like Muslims and everything, but sir, prove to me that you're not in league with Osama bin Laden and trying to attack our country, seeing as how you're a Muslim. And I had been through a brutal campaign. I had somehow learned to just chill, ease up, relax, don't react. And after that exchange, I said, look, I don't have to prove my, patriotic stripes. I love my country and I'm proud to serve. And, I answered the question. And when it was over, I had a number of dear friends say, man, you should have cussed him out. You should have told him off. You should have told him, prove to me that you're not a child molester. I had a lot of sort of like suggested responses. But at the end of all those responses, the response was like, but you did it the best way. You were calm. You didn't return bad for bad. You returned bad for good. And I'm telling you, it's worth trying. And I'm telling you that when somebody, I don't know, makes an offensive cartoon, what if we did just say, you know, I'm offended by your cartoon, but you have the right to draw whatever you want. And nothing you do touches me. And as a matter of fact, that's how it is. If you want to burn a Quran, I believe that in societies where they burn books, it's not long before they burn people, so we need to be vigilant. But you have the right to do it. It's nothing but paper anyway. And it's actually not the Quran that you're burning because you can't do that anyway. I mean, what if we responded in love as opposed to anger? I mean, anger responses evoke angry counter responses, and it just keeps going up. But a loving response puts it all down. I remember, if I may just use another example from my own life. Look, I did not have any grand plan to swear in on the Quran. A friend of mine who was a Somali journalist who had a late-night cable access program asked me on that late-night access Somali language program if I won the election, would I swear on the Quran? I said, the election hasn't come. I don't know. I'm worried about winning the election before I worry about what I'm swearing in on. He said, but if you do, and he pressed me. I said, oh, of course I am. What else would I swear on? I hadn't thought it through. I just answered the question, as I often do. And so, but even though I thought nobody was watching late night cable access Somali language television, it so happens that some people in the conservative end of the political spectrum were watching. And this thing blew up. When I got here, I didn't really know anybody. I'd never even been a page. I think I'd been to Washington a total of about 5 times before I got to Congress. I met colleagues who were like, well, boy, I'm getting letters about you. Virgil Good is writing about you. I met my good friend Jim Moran close to the first day. He said, yeah, man, let me introduce you. You recall, Jim, you introduced me to Virgil Good, and I shook his hand after he told his constituents that if we don't support his immigration bill, many more Muslims will be immigrating to the United States, running for Congress, winning, and demanding to be sworn in on the Quran. Like, it's kind of a stretch, but whatever. So, but instead of calling them bigots and calling them haters and calling them names, somebody wrote me a letter and said, you know, you should swear in on Jefferson's Quran, an all-American Quran, if you will. And I took that good advice, and the Library of Congress forever has a spot in my heart, you know, for it. And we called, and you guys said, no problem, and you ushered that book over, and we did that swearing in, and I didn't hear any more about it. It's sort of like, just kill the issue. And so, there you go.
I have one final question before we open it up to a brief Q&A with the assembled. You've spoken a lot about the Quran, and you've just spoken to us about Jefferson's version or edition of the Quran. Now, Jefferson's copy of the Quran. As you know, Thomas Jefferson did an experiment with the Bible in which he cut out what he believed to be inauthentic and certainly to him unsavory passages from the Bible. Should we do that with the Quran sometime within your lifetime and mine?
Well, that's a great question. Let me put it like this. You know, I read the Quran daily. You know, during Ramadan, you know, we read 1/30th of it every day. So every year you should read the whole Quran. It's a book I draw great inspiration from, and when I'm in a jam or anxious, I go to it for inspiration. But I don't go to every word of it. I go to certain passages. I have my favorites. And then there's some things written in the Quran that, quite frankly, I don't understand. And I don't claim that they're wrong, that they don't supposed to be there. I just say that I don't really understand. From a 2011 interpretation, they don't fit with the norms we live with today. here's what I say. Only God knows what is really intended, right? And I am comfortable with allowing God to know that and allowing and accepting the fact that God has endowed me with a critical mind to understand this book within the context and space in which I live. An example, there is a passage in the Quran where it talks about if you have a spouse who you're having trouble with, you should first tell her, that you don't like what she's doing. Second, don't share her bed anymore. And the third one, it says, it's interpreted in English as hit her lightly. That's what the English translation says. I've researched this because hitting a woman is about the most repugnant thing I can imagine. There are other repugnant things, but that's right up there. And so, was it something written for the times people were in? Here's the other interesting thing. If you read through the Prophet Muhammad's life and what he did, and at that time, whether it fits with our modern sensibilities or not, plural marriage was the norm, and that's how people got along all across the world. There's no recorded incident of him striking one of his wives. And the first wife he had, Khadijah, he only had one wife until her passing. And then after that, and he was trying to build cohesion, he would take on wives in order to build solidarity with other tribes. But there's no recorded incident of him striking a spouse. And there were some relationships that ended. He actually was divorced. So the thing is that I don't know what to do with that. There's one interpretation that I read that said it doesn't mean beat like hit. It means like beat a hasty retreat. That is one way people have interpreted it. I say this. I don't know. I'm simply saying I'm not gonna. It doesn't say you must. It says you can, and then I'm not sure that's even the right interpretation. There are English translations of the Quran that I'm absolutely certain are wrong. Mm-hmm. Let me give you an example before we move on. In the English translation of Quran, in the first revelation Prophet Muhammad received, it says, read, or it could be interpreted as recite in the name of your Lord who created mankind from and then the English says, blood clot. Arabic writers and translators and people who are learned in Quran and in the classical Arabic of the Quran, because by the way, the Quran is not written in modern Arabic. It's like us reading Shakespeare. Say that it does not say blood clot. What it actually says is a thing that clings. That's what it says. Created you, the word alaq, A-L-A-Q, is a thing that clings. And this could be interpreted as in an attachment or an emotional attachment, or created you in love. And it also could be, say that we created you as a like people have said that this could be like the sperm mixed with ovum that begins to attach to the uterine wall. And so but we know that it's not blood clot. So what I'm saying is that, first of all, just because you speak Arabic doesn't mean you understand the Quran, because, as I said, time has changed meaning. And if you don't read Arabic and you're reading an English translation, there is a very high likelihood that you could get it wrong. So going back to this thing about would I figuratively want to simply read out certain parts of the Quran, let's face it, by focusing on certain passages that bring me hope, sustenance, and inspiration, there are parts of it that I don't read as much. There are parts of it that I don't understand. And if you don't understand something, I don't think it's a good idea to be definitive and certain about what it is. So I hope that answers the question.
Well, it more than answers the question. I think it actually goes to another beautiful passage of the Quran, chapter 3, verse 7, which basically states that some verses of this book are ambiguous, and some verses are precise. But it is those with disbelief in their hearts who seize upon the ambiguous and decree interpretations for others. For only your Lord knows the final meanings of these verses. Once again, it comes back to the majesty of the Creator, who has the full and final truth, and the fact that we don't. Which is not to say that, we are nothing. It's Allahu Akbar is not God is great. It is that God is greater, and we are in relationship with Him. So that as we have faith in Him, He ought to be able to continue having the faith in us that allowed Him to breathe life into us in the first place. And what Creator is so insecure as to not give you and me and you the opportunity to grow in freedom and therefore in faith. With that, let's open it up to audience questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I think that that's ridiculous, okay? But let me answer it this way. The Quran does say, there are passages in the Quran that say things like, oppression is worse than slaughter. There's a phrase in there that says, kill them where you find them. It says these things. Here, let me give you now, do you remember the beginning of my presentation when I talked about how Muhammad the prophet taught there's only one God, there should be justice, there should be freedom for humanity. Then people who literally were in his tribe and related to him, known as a group called the Quraysh, they are the ones who brought violence to him for teaching what was revealed to him. So then they persecute them, torture them, then they leave. Remember I talked about going to Yathrib, right? Then I talked about how the city was renamed Medina, which simply means city, and then I talked about the charter, right? So then the Quraysh followed him to the city and still wanted to make war. You understand? These are the facts. When the Quran talks about the unbelievers or the disbelievers, he is talking about these people specifically. This is why it's dangerous to read a word without any sort of historic understanding of who they were talking about, when they were talking about, what they were talking about. Because the Quran is not written in a way that says, when it uses the term unbeliever, it doesn't mean people who are not Muslim. It means these specific people who are waging war on the Muslim community, right? So that's the reality. It's simply a matter of, if you are 100% pacifist, then you might say, well, I don't like that. But if you do believe that you have the right to employ force to protect your own life, then I think that you can, then I don't find the passage troubling. But I think you should read it, you should read the whole thing, and you should read the history that surrounds the time. Because the Quran was revealed over the course, I don't know if people know this, do you know the Quran was revealed over the course of 23 years? And did you know that it wasn't all revealed at once?
And that's part of the point of the abrogation theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is that there are later verses and there are earlier verses, and that the later verses upend the earlier verses, which is very convenient since the later verses, it is according to this theory, are the violent ones.
Right, but the later ones are when the Muslim community was under violent attack by the Quraysh, by the people who led Mecca. So, I'm going to tell you this. I am not scholarly enough in Islamic history to tell you exactly how this theory of abrogation works. I know what the word means, but I've heard people, mostly people who demonstrate a lot of hostility toward people who are Muslim, talk about this idea of abrogation. They also like to talk about taqiyya, and they have a whole lot of ways to simply discredit Muslims, right? Let me get to the heart of the matter. If the people you are dealing with, the Muslims, are sincere, honorable people, and you believe they have a human right to live and to be respected, then you work with them. If you don't believe that, then don't. But I would not try to become an instant Islamic scholar. I don't know. And then there's some people sitting right near you who can help you much better than me.
Well, I just quickly, if I may, just pick up on this point because it's so important. I hear this from people all the time, the so-called abrogation theory. I disagree with my good friend Keith on several issues, but I come to the same conclusion as he does about why the abrogation theory, frankly, doesn't really hold water. My simple point is that it's accepted that the way the Quran is organized is not by chronology of revelation. We actually don't know why certain verses came to Muhammad at certain times. The Quran is organized according to the size of verse, from the longest at the beginning to from the shortest, longest at the beginning to the shortest at the end. So the fact that these verses came to him for who knows what reason, the fact that, and it is a fact, that he himself was illiterate, that he basically outsourced the transcription of the Quran to his companions, that they themselves were very error-prone, being human, and that all of these revelations had to be recorded on stones and parchment and leaves and whatever other surfaces were available at the time, suggests to me that there are plenty of reasons not to take everything in the Quran literally. That mistakes, and I will say this, I am free to say this, that there may very well be errors in the Quran, which is why the gift of free will that God has given all of us, if we believe in God, is so precious. Because maybe there's a reason for that. And the reason could be precisely because none of the scriptures, none of the documents that we call scripture are indeed foolproof. And that it is our both challenge and opportunity to interpret them in ways that allow us to understand, this relationship with God, that he has to have faith in us as much as we need to have faith in him. But that chronology of revelation, the fact that we don't know when these verses came down to the prophet and when, means that we don't know what the later verses are and what the earlier verses are. And I believe, and Keith touched on this, that the abrogation theory is very convenient both for Islam bashers and for Islam supremacists. Though they oppose one another, they come again to the same conclusion, which is that the right way to practice Islam is with violence, and it serves both of their purposes. I have just been told, ladies and gentlemen, that there is another vote that Keith needs to be at 12:30. Can somebody tell me what the time is? 12:30? Keith, can we have one final question and we'll both make it real quick?
What I need to know from Steve back there is when they call the vote. Because when the vote's called,
right, we've got some time.
Okay.
When the vote's know, Steve,
when the vote's called, I gotta be gotcha. Over there in 15 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Okay, let me go to Muhammad at the back.
Hi, my name is Mohammed, and I have kind of a more practical question. So whenever I'm having a debate with a fellow conservative Muslim, I have two choices: whether to have the debate within the language and logic of Islam or outside that language. The first one always ends up in a tie because I could bring many surahs, hadiths that would support my liberal ideas, and they could bring many others that would support their conservative ideas. And if we have the debate outside that language, it's not a common ground anymore. So it always ends up in a confusion. My question is, what should one do to win this debate?
Well, there was a number of ways that I thought about approaching our discussion today. when Irshad called me and said, let's talk about Islam and freedom, you know, I thought, well, should I start with Quran? How should I do this? Should I bring out UN reports? Where should I begin? And I was inspired to say, how did Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, begin his mission? What was the context? And you notice I didn't cite Quran. What I did is I said, wait a minute, you know, here's somebody who peacefully received revelation, tried to offer it to the world, was denied the opportunity to do so, and then sought out freedom, and then established it when he could. So here's my point. I think that if you're arguing with somebody who was ego invested and has an identity connection to their point, it may always end in a tie. But if you're trying to talk with people who have an open mind, I think that you should first go to the larger context and then offer, you know, Quran and Hadith and to help flesh that out. But in my mind, you know, you do need a person willing to have the discussion in the first place. And if it's simply a contest in which there will be a winner or a loser or a draw, maybe you shouldn't even, I don't know, waste your time.
Okay, let us go to the gentleman on this side. Yes, sir.
Imam Dai Abdullah. Okay. Imam Dai Abdullah. Hello, Irshad.
Assalamu alaikum.
Keith, how are you? We're old friends. And I wanted to ask you a question. Overall, with Muslims for Progressive Values, which you're both familiar, the issue frequently comes from within the Islamic society in discussions that go on between various individuals there. Though the Orthodox only represent about 20% of those who identify as Muslim, who come to the mosque, things of this nature, how do we expand this for those who are more moderate Muslims, who may not necessarily follow the Orthodox line? And I'd like your opinion on that. How do we get in touch with them? How do we get them involved in the discussion so that the various points of view can be discussed?
Right. Imam, I can only tell you, and I'll be very brief about this because I've stated it earlier in the conversation, that my focus is on God and not on God's self-appointed ambassadors. And when I focus on God, I find that moderates, first of all, understand that I am coming from a point of faith, not from a point of, closeted atheism. And moreover, that by reminding both moderates and conservatives that the very essence of any monotheism, but most especially Islam, is that there is only one God and He alone knows the full and final truth. Sometimes you'll have to agree to disagree, but what I find frankly troubling is that moderates, self-described, and not just conservatives, often refuse to agree to disagree and insist on trumping. And that is when the discussion ceases to be a discussion and becomes more of a showdown, at which point I've taken the advice of the Quran to simply, and in a friendly way, walk away. Walk away, let the dust settle, and see if there's more discussion to be had later.
I recommend taking responsibility for holding the conversation. There are a lot of spaces, including this one, where conversations can be held about various critical issues. Look, what is the American Muslim responsibility to the poor, right? Where do we discuss this? I haven't been to, I know that people do it, but it's not a regular feature of mosque life, where we're sitting down saying, what are we going to do about, the crisis in the uninsured in America? We're kind of internally focused. We want to talk about Islamophobia, which is real, but we also want to talk about it because that casts us in the role of victim, which is an emotionally satisfying place to be in. And I would ask you to hold the debate. What if you got a committee and said, we're going to identify 25 topics, And over the course of this year, we're going to hold forum discussions every week, every 2 weeks, and whoever wants to come can come. And the only basis for excluding anybody is if their behavior prevents the conversation from being held. And let loose on, what the topics will be. And then put those, if people give their permission, put it on video, put it on the internet. I'm telling you that discussion and dialogue is the key to this. Because if you have discussion and dialogue, then one person could say one thing, one person could say another thing, and then the community watching will say, see, two people can have a view, and there's no fist fight that broke out, and nobody threatened to take anybody out.
The only amendment I would make to Keith's point is that today we live in at a time, and I think this is global, it's not just here in America, where people try to shut down discussion by saying, you have to respect me. The word respect has become, in many cases, a euphemism for don't challenge me, okay? And the way I respond to that, since we're talking about tactics and strategies, is, wait a minute, the very fact that I'm engaging you in discussion means that I have faith in your capacity to think critically, okay? I'm not infantilizing you. I'm not treating you as a child. I'm engaging with you as an equal and a peer. That is my definition of respect.
And can I add on to that? There is a portion in Quran, in Al-Baqarah, the second, the longest surah or the chapter in Quran, where Allah announces that he's going to put a vice regent in the earth. And this is man, this is Adam, right? And the angels ask a question. They say, are you going to, they must have known something about mankind that we're still grappling with. Are you going to put somebody who's going to be in the earth and cause shedding of blood? They knew about the nature of man a little bit, huh? And Allah doesn't say, how dare you ask me that? How dare you? Allah does not get angry, animated, and offended because somebody asked him something. Am I right about this?
I think, again, any deity worthy of worship is not insecure.
Right, but think about how if you ask some people just a question in a moderate voice, respectfully ask, they get all out of joint because how dare you ask me that? Their dignity gets offended and they want to rebuke you simply because you had the audacity to ask them a question. Now, if the angels who are bound to obey God, because we're not bound to obey God, we disobey, right? We're free to. Can ask Allah a question. How come somebody can't ask you a question? Right?
Or you, him.
Ask them a question. There's got to be ground rules, respect, moderated voices, no name calling. If you do this discussion group that I'm proposing, maybe you come up with 5 ground rules. And this is you have to agree to this in order to participate.
Let us go
Last
to this
question.
side. Yeah, okay. And yes, ma'am. Right here. Yes, right in the second row. Or sir? Yeah, I can't see very well with the lighting here.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum. I'm a journalist from Indonesia, but I'm based here. I like the message that you said about making freedom as a core value of Islam. I think that's something that's very important. Take away for me anyway. My question to you or to Irshad is, where do you draw the line on freedom? Right? At what stage would you say, okay, enough is enough, I cannot tolerate this anymore, and maybe that's when you would declare jihad, quote unquote. Thank you.
This is a good question. Where do you draw the line on freedom? This is a question that we try to answer in the Congress every single day. There's no bright line on where you draw the line on freedom, but I have a few ideas. One is, first of all, here's where we shall not draw the line on whether somebody's offended. Now, I'm not saying if somebody acts offensively, I think, then you can be offended or not. But simply the asking of a question or somebody saying something, I don't think you're entitled to be not offended. So let's not draw the line there. I think that if you want more freedom and you want more ideas and you want more, then you have to have a pretty low threshold, right? For example, I'm a sincere and devoted Muslim, but I don't think those Muslims who acted up over that cartoon were right. I think they were quite wrong. I think that you should be free to draw a nasty, disrespectful picture like that. And we're free to say it's a nasty, disrespectful picture, but we're not free to prevent the person from doing it or to harm them because they did it. We're free to disagree with Salman Rushdie, but we're not free to threaten to kill him because he wrote what he wanted to write. We're free to say that burning Quran for the purpose of offending Muslims is offensive in and of itself, but it's your book, your personal property, you bought it, and if you burn it, you're a rude person, but that's it. See, we have First Amendment rights too. We have freedom of expression. So what's the limit? The limit is you cannot violate someone's physical integrity. You cannot assault someone. You cannot, you're not free to injure someone, right? And in American law, we try to, yes, the Klan can march even through Skokie, and they can get a permit to do so, but they cannot wade into the crowd and harm people who are protesting them. So I think that, there's a difficult line to draw, but I personally, would draw the line. I would make it a low threshold, and I would say that the real thing that would trigger a legitimate community response to prevent somebody's freedom would be if it harms others physically. Now, of course, I haven't thought this thing all the way through, so there's probably some exceptions, but.
Well, I would draw the line there as well at physical injury, and I'll just finish up this portion of our event with this example. I remember, I remember many occasions in which I've been challenged by Muslims over the reconciliation of Islam and homosexuality. I remember this one imam actually stood up at an event of mine and said, I don't believe I have to accept you as an openly gay person. Why should I? And I responded, you don't have to. I'm not asking you to. I don't need your approval. I seek only the approval of my Creator and my conscience, and my Creator lives in my conscience, so that's fine. What I'm asking of you, I said, is do not physically harm me or others simply because they are gay. And I said, can we agree to that? And he said, oh yeah, sure. I said, khalas, that's it, that's enough. It's enough for me. My dignity doesn't reside with his approval, but my physical integrity is dependent on his not physically lashing out at me. What more do we need? Keith, I'm asking if you have a final comment?
All I want to say is, providing for the freedom of others does not necessarily imply approval.
Right.
And we cannot live our lives subject to the approval of others. Freedom means the right to dissent. And the word right to dissent means protectable, enforceable, you have a remedy if that right is violated. So if we restore what I believe is a fundamental right of freedom within the context of Islam, based on the example of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that just means peace be upon him, then we will not only improve the lives of Muslims, we will improve the lives of our fellow human beings, and we will really be we will honor God by our service.
I want to finish up, if I may. I have this habit of quoting what I think are beautiful verses from the Quran, in part because I want to remind Muslims that they exist, and I want to teach non-Muslims that these verses exist. So there's plenty of room for interpretation. beautiful, beautiful passage, chapter 4, 135, which states, believers, conduct yourselves with justice and bear true witness before God, and here's the kicker, even if it be against yourselves, your parents, or your relatives. Okay? That is a profoundly anti-tribal message, and one that encourages the freedom of the individual to speak his or her truth to power for a greater good. Thank you very much, everybody. And please give Congressman Ellison a big round of applause. Thank you, sir. Thank you.